Hello everyone, nubkeks here. Welcome back to Nub Raids, and in today's video I want to give you my beginner guide to taking on the Hydra clan boss in Raid Shadow Legends. It's by far the hardest boss in the game. Nightmare Hydra, the hardest one at the moment, is just on another level really to everything else that's in the game, and we know there's further difficulties coming. So I want to give you my guide to that in today's video. We're going to be going through my Hydra cheat sheet. I showed you one page of this before in one of my previous videos. We're going to be looking at, my tier list for the different buffs and debuffs and utility, applying those to how to counter specific heads, recommended stats for your teams, and then a few different sample teams. So hopefully it's going to be a good way to get you into Hydra and start pointing you in the right direction. I will say the most important thing, guys, the number one thing I will say right at the start, is really important to have the right mindset with Hydra, okay? I like to think Hydra is very like Dark Souls. Some people love it, some people absolutely hate it. It's important to understand why. It's because there's a lot of failure involved in this, right? You're not going to walk into Hydra and then the first team you throw in, hey, we did it, we won, easy, smooth sailing, nothing ever goes wrong. No, this is a game mode that is designed to be ridiculously hard. It's extremely punishing. You're going to fail constantly. One nice thing, you can start off your run and you can regroup. You're going to be doing that a lot. It's going to happen and it's going to take you a long time. Like, you can free regroup out. Also, since they added it in, once you end the run, or if it ends for you, you can also click free regroup. So, if you're unhappy with doing absolutely zero damage, you can free regroup out and your key is still there and you're good, right? But yeah, this is it's very hard. So have that mindset. Be prepared for that failure. Be prepared to struggle, to work for it, but for it to pay off. Obviously, you're going to hate that. Some people will hate that, and that's fine. But it's just important not to... a lot of people fall into the trap of they get very upset because they're failing, and then they want to push it away, and they don't want to deal with it, and then they're never able to succeed at it because they just refuse to engage with it. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. Right, let's go into it then. I will say as well, in terms of roughly speaking, if you ask me about, let's say, an average free-to-play player, how long is it going to take you to be able to one key normal, or one key hard, or brutal, or nightmare? How hard is that, roughly speaking? It's difficult to give you a strict answer because, let me see, like, if, for example, if you pull Necrizia, hey, you could get lucky and suddenly you're going to beat Hydra kind of for free, right? So definitely some of that stuff depends. I will say it'll probably take a fairly average player something like 6 to 8 months, I would think, to one key normal. You could do it faster. Actually, one of the sample teams I'm going to be showing you today, he actually one keyed hard after 6 months of free to play, right before he got Sylve the Drakes. I think he's a better than average player, though. I think that's actually like someone who's put a lot of work in. I think for a very average player, probably about 6 months for normal, probably about a year, at least a year for hard. And then brutal might take you even 2 years, and nightmare could take you 3. At that point, it really starts to depend, right? The gear requirements get very high. The champion requirements get very high. But some of the big things to look out for, of course, are just, those guaranteed champions you get along the way. Like Arbiter, getting your Lydia. These things are really helpful. Fusions can be super helpful as well. Guaranteed champions and just the champions that you're pulling. All of this stuff adds up. Let's dive in then. Let's take a look here. I clicked on the wrong thing. There we go. Now we're in. So this is my buff and debuff and utility tier list. And this is, roughly speaking, how I prioritize things, which can really help you when you look at a specific champion and you try to figure out how good they are for Hydra. How many of these S tier buffs or debuffs are they bringing? Are they bringing any of this utility stuff? Things that are not buffs, but cleansing off debuffs, turn meter boosting, ally attacks. This stuff is all super useful. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. I'll kind of leave you guys to go through it yourself. Essentially, broadly speaking, as a rough rule of thumb, if you're bringing as many of these things as possible, it's going to go fairly well for you. I will say the buffs, we've got a ton of defensive buffs in here. Strengthen, increase defense, perfect fail, ally protection, shield. You don't need to bring all of those for normal, but bringing several of these really does become quite essential to actually survive on things like brutal and nightmare, for example. But yeah, I think probably the best way to break this down really is to look at countering specific heads. So let me zoom this in. so it's easier for you guys to see. Here we go. And we'll go through them one by one. But these are some of those key buffs and debuffs and pieces of utility that I like to bring to counter heads, and it gives you an idea of what you need to look for, right? So the Head of Mischief, this guy's a real pain. He's the one that comes in, he steals your buffs, and he spreads them around. I think that's very difficult to deal with when you're starting off. You can see that block buffs is the number one thing I'm bringing. This will stop him. Even if he does successfully steal your buffs, they get blocked. He doesn't get them. He will still get a lot of turn meter, and that's nasty, but you can deal with it. A Mischief Tank. This is something I've done entire videos on, but the idea of this is that the Head of Mischief always targets whoever has the most buffs. So you can bring in very specific champions. So for example, if we jump in here, in this team setup right here, Aboro is a really good Mischief Tank because she comes in, gives herself increased crit rate, increased crit damage, perfect veil if she crits, and then revive on death as well whenever she gets perfect veil. That's 4 buffs, right? She's going to be 4 buffs ahead of everyone else. Nearly every single time Mischief is going to be targeting her. And we can basically use that and build them with really high resistance. We'll talk about the stats that you need as well here. Build them with really high resistance, and they'll always be targeted, and Mischief will never get the buffs. This is not essential, but it's a really consistent way to counter Head of Mischief. So that's something that's certainly worth considering. Decrease accuracy. This obviously really helps because you decrease his accuracy. He can't steal as frequently. Decreasing his speed is really good. Hex lets you target him directly. I think Hex is extremely underrated for Hydra. It also replicates a good chunk of damage. So it's very, very good, especially with single target damage dealers that can slam damage into Mischief. It's super good. And then just building resistance or increase resistance. This is a buff that is relatively new to the game. We don't have many champions that do it, but if you do have an increased resistance champion, it could be something to consider. But the Head of Torment, this is the guy that fears you, and you can't resist the fears, unfortunately. So resistance, increased resistance, not going to help you there. The only way to get past it is to not attack him without a perfect veil, right? So you want to keep perfect veil up if you're going to be hitting him. So perfect veil is very good. You can also bring in a cleanser to cleanse off those true fears. And yeah, he's actually fairly straightforward to counter. It's just there's very few champions that actually bring perfect veil and good cleansers, so that is sort of the difficulty there. But the things I look to bring to counter him are relatively straightforward. For the Head of Blight, this is the one that throws out the poisons and the poison cloud. You can hit through poison cloud if HP burns are already out there. The easiest way though, is to bring in block buffs and just stop it going up in the first place. Decreasing his accuracy to stop the poisons, or cleansing off the poisons. HP burn, so you can hit through the cloud. It also does bonus damage to this head, so that's really nice. And then simply resisting the poisons really adds a ton of survivability to your team. This is one of the big things that makes it, in my opinion, difficult to get into Hydra, and that sort of does gate off the higher difficulties. And I would certainly consider it's going to be in your Great Hall. Getting your resistance built up here is extremely important. For me in the Great Hall, the two that I really value are accuracy and resistance. Resistance is one of those awkward stats where you need a lot more of it than they have accuracy. So until you really start building it up, it really is very hard, right? It doesn't do anything if you don't have enough of it. So I do recommend, though, building it up. It helps you so much in Doom Tower Hard. It helps you so much in Hydra. It helps you in Arena as well. So I would really value that much more highly than crit damage or something like that personally. Of course, other people would disagree. I value it very high if Hydra is something that you want to succeed in. It's so good for so many of these heads. For the Head of Wrath, this one is super dangerous. He's the guy that after you hit him 15 times, he goes crazy, big damage boost. He hits you really hard. Block buffs is so important on him to stop the reflect damage going up, to stop him getting increased attack, decrease attack to reduce his damage. That's a huge difference. If you imagine him at normal strength and he gets increased attack versus he's got no increased attack, decreased attack, he's doing like 3 times as much damage with increased attack on as he is with no increased attack and decreased attack. It's a massive swing in the amount of damage that he does. That's super important. Buff removal can be good here to remove increased attack if he does get it, or his other buffs. And then just a bunch of defensive stuff like strengthen, shielding, ally protection, increased defense, decreased crit rate. Actually quite useful for this head as well, because that's what can sometimes get you. He does a big crit and takes you down. Also worth considering what affinity your team is against Head of Wrath, because you get a bonus 15% chance to crit if you're the positive affinity. So if Head of Wrath is blue affinity and you bring in a big green affinity team, he's going to be critting you 30% of the time. It's going to be really rough. Head of Decay, this guy's fairly straightforward. He's the one that cleanses. Provoke, you can provoke him and stop him doing that. That's very useful. It can be very difficult, of course, to consistently provoke him. You need really good champions for that. Decrease speed can definitely help. Decrease accuracy and cleanse then help with his A1, because that heal reduction debuff he puts out, always on your lowest health member, can get them killed very easily, so that can certainly help. And then for Suffering, although I've written a lot here, you don't need to worry about Suffering too much. He's just kind of annoying, but he doesn't do too much. Block buffs is really useful. He puts out ally protection. He puts reflect damage on himself. So block buffs. Brimstone the Blessing, really effective on this guy because he will just take his turns anyway and it will proc it. You can proc 2 back to back if he does his extra turn thing, which is great. Buff removal to remove the increase, the reflect damage or ally protection. Strengthen. Poison is good against him. Increase accuracy is good because he gives them all more resistance. But yeah, that is broadly speaking what we're looking at here. And I think one of the big things for me when I look at this, you can see my favorite debuff, really no question. Mischief, Blight, Wrath, and Suffering. Block buffs, block buffs, block buffs, block buffs. This is like your big thing to come in and make Hydra easier. The big champions for this, you can see Ugo. We've got Ugo for days here in the Nightmare teams. That is one of the big things. For normal, it's a bit different because you can kind of overpower it and hard as well with later game champions. I'd say another one to watch out for that is absolutely fantastic for this. That's not too hard to get. Umbral Enchantress, block buffs for 3 turns, 100% chance, 3-turn cooldown, void affinity. Really, really good for this as well. Not as good as Ugo, but still extremely good. But yeah, that's one of the big things that you will be looking for. And yeah, there you go. Again, countering Wrath is probably the most important. He's the one that's just going to wipe out your team if you can't deal with him. So making sure you've got this stuff. I think countering Blight is very important. Block buffs can kind of control Mischief enough starting out that you get away with it. And then you can play around Torment on manual, but it's a bit awkward. And then, yeah, this sort of stuff. You get the gist. You get the idea here. Let's go in. I guess maybe we should go to sample teams to break it up. It's been fairly info intensive. Let's take a quick look at the stats here, though. I think one interesting thing is actually quite hard. I did up some sample stats of what I might do, but it's kind of difficult to give you like a strict build because it can be so different based off your teams. So definitely take this with a big pinch of salt. For example, we look at the damage dealer, you can see in terms of their defensive stats, I've really not cranked them up very much at all over the difficulties. I tend to just aim for, with damage dealers, something like this as a minimum, as being pretty good. Now for Brutal and Nightmare, I'd love to get more, but it's not super necessary. The reason being that I often start to rely much more on shields, on ally protection, and strengthen and stuff like that. Those buffs become super important on the higher difficulties to kind of keep the damage dealers alive. The main things I'm looking to crank up as we go up the difficulties for damage is typically getting their speed higher. And again, these are sort of minimum speeds, right? So minimum 220 for Nightmare. And I'd really love it to be more like 250, and then 350 accuracy. We'll talk about accuracy requirements in a second. Whereas for normal, you only need 160 is quite doable. For like a fairly typical support, you can see sort of similar stuff. So they start off quite squishy. We're going to increase their defensive stats and stuff a decent chunk, but a lot of it really does come from your buffs and a good team comp. Speed is the big thing. Going from like 200 on normal is what I'd like to aim for, to 250 on Nightmare. And again, you can go higher than that and it's all good. Resistance, we will actually try to build up some on Nightmare. If you've got decreased accuracy out there, having a bit of resistance actually makes the world of difference. And oftentimes I'm trying to build them. This is sort of a minimum. I really like them to have 250 as a minimum for Nightmare, but often I'm building them more like 400 or something. For accuracy then, you really want them to be consistent. Unlike the damage dealers can miss their debuff sometimes. For supports, they want to land it all the time. So I'm looking for 200 for normal, 400 for Nightmare. Let's check this out. So in terms of your accuracy for debuffs and resistance, to resist their debuffs, there's obviously buffs that can interfere with this, like decrease resistance makes this easier, increase accuracy, all the rest. But you can see for normal, it's actually quite straightforward. What we have with the accuracy numbers here is the Head of Suffering has a passive that adds 50 resistance. He adds 50 resistance to the heads when he is there. So they're the numbers in the brackets. So, I mean, if you look at normal, if Head of Suffering is not in the starting rotation, you know, the accuracy that you could need could be super, super low. I generally recommend just building enough accuracy to deal with Suffering, or consider bringing in an accuracy aura when Suffering is in there to get you past that if you need to. You can see normal is really low requirements for accuracy. Like the worst requirement is 210 for Head of Suffering himself. So that's very, very reasonable. When we go to hard, stuff jumps up about 50 accuracy more required on average. You jump up to brutal, it's 65 more accuracy. You jump up to nightmare, and I think it's about 80 more accuracy required. So yeah, at the highest end of nightmare, 405 accuracy. I mean, technically speaking, you do with your masteries, you know, you get a bit extra. So for example, my Krisk right now, he only has 380. He's a little tiny bit low, but bearing in mind, you will, for example, get an extra 16 accuracy from Swarm Smiter if you take it. So you can do some stuff like that, you know. But I try to aim for roughly about 400 for nightmare, just so that you don't have to worry about this. But yeah, there you go. So these are sort of, I think, good reference points. So you can figure out, for example, okay, my provoker for nightmare, if there's no Head of Suffering in there, if they have 335 accuracy, they're going to get away with it most of the time. But if Suffering comes in, I really want 385 to be consistent. There's always a 3% chance your debuff will be resisted anyway, but you want to really max that out. So this is a pretty straightforward requirement. When we come to resistance, this one is much more nebulous. Basically, the rough rule of thumb, to resist roughly about 90%, it's not quite that, but you know, about 90% of the time, you want to have about 100 more resistance than they have accuracy. To get up closer to the maximum, you want about 150 more. So this is the resistance, which I think is really good for general supports to work 90% of the time. For a Mischief tank, for someone that's dedicated to tanking Head of Mischief, for example, on Nightmare, you can see 450 is 90%. You want them to be as consistent as possible. 90% is not good enough for a Mischief tank. So for a Mischief tank, again, Krisk is a great... Krisk, come back here. Great example is Krisk. Krisk comes in 500. We've got an extra 50 there, just trying to make that as consistent as possible. But yeah, there you go. So you can see the resistance requirements are actually very, very high, guys. This is very difficult. Again, this is resisting 90%. You can be lower than this. As soon as you start getting equal to their accuracy, I think they go down to about a 93% success rate against you. And then for every bit of resistance that you add, it does more and more. So even if you're not hitting the 90%, getting some good resistance on your supports can make a big difference. And then, of course, consider as well bringing things in like a decreased accuracy debuff. Really drastically cuts this stuff down. So we could actually do, if I get my calculator up here, calculator, here we go. So Head of Mischief, again, you could do quick maths. I don't need to do this, but I'm just doing it so you can see. So 350 accuracy is actually how much Mischief has. If we divide that by 2, divide by 2, there we go. If you half his accuracy or decrease accuracy, he actually has 175, and then you add 100 onto that, 275 is going to resist him 90% of the time if he has decreased accuracy. You add another 50 onto that, and you're going to basically have the best possible chance to resist him with 325 accuracy if he has decreased accuracy on. So these debuffs can make a really big difference. And this is why as well I say, you know, for my supports for Nightmare, I'm trying to get them around about, I like to get, you know, about 250 resistance in there, because when we get decreased accuracy out, that's where it can start to add up and you can start resisting other stuff. But yeah, you can see the resistance is really tough. I think in particular, Mischief is hilarious, where he starts off like on normal. It's nasty, right? Then on hard, it jumps up 60 resistance more needed on hard. It's a massive jump. Then to brutal, it jumps up 35, and then to nightmare, it jumps up 5. So it's really over budgeted in these lower things. They don't really want you to use a Mischief tank, but you can. It's just, you know, it's intensive. That's why I say block buffs is kind of the easier way to do it. Mischief tanking when you get a bit later in the game, though, is really good too. Let's look at some sample teams then to wrap this one up. And guys, let me give you a couple of other things as we go into this. A couple of very important things. I'm going to be posting this spreadsheet in the useful info tab on my Discord. But if you come up here, Hydra stats by Bobo, go into this as well. look, and this is going to have all of the actual stats of the Hydra heads. So you can see for each rotation what their affinity is going to be, the exact accuracy, resistance, their speed, all of their stats are in there for each difficulty, for each rotation. Absolutely fantastic. So if you want to dive more in depth in terms of planning your team, I highly recommend using that. So we come in here, but this was his first sample team, which is really cool. In my Discord, again, people coming into Team Showcase, they're sharing their teams all the time. So this was Tasty Cardboard. He did this team just yesterday, actually. On hard difficulty, he did 27 million damage on hard. And there you go. So we can come in here. You see, this is his team, and these are the different things that they're bringing in, right? So you've got the 2 damage dealers with Ninja and Yannicka. One of them brings HP burn. They both actually bring perfect veil, so they can get past the head of torment. They've got Ugo bringing in the block buffs and decreased defense and some cleansing. They've got Mithrala for an accuracy aura and tons of cleansing defensive buffs. Shamrock giving them the speed manipulation. Molly's coming into Mischief, Tank, and Provoke, and bringing the Revive and Turn meter. So I think this team all comes together and actually was a very successful team. Not the best team in the world, but a really good team, and a good one for hard difficulty. I did throw in some team building tips here as well, and this is what I'm saying. I recommend, Discord or YouTube videos and stuff to get ideas for champions and teams, because there might be things that you're not thinking about. Very commonly, this 2 damage dealer, like we've got here, the 2 damage dealers, is quite common. You can see that Ninja's really shining. 2 damage, 4 supports is the most common. It's not the only one, and one of these sample teams is very different. It's not the only way you can do it, but that's a very common thing to look for. The reason you've got 2 damage dealers is so that when one of them gets eaten, the other one can help to break them free. Max HP damage then pulls ahead on Brutal and Nightmare. So if I look at my clan, you'll start to see that kind of a good bit. Like we go back into hard and we can see, it's champions like the Trunda, Sissia, Ninja, Rotos even, that are kind of smashing out the damage. If we jump up to Nightmare, we're starting to see Husks and Geomancers and Husks and Geomancers and Royal Guards, and a Crizia would be in there. So there's a big difference there. It's usually, I think, in Brutal Nightmare that the max HP damage dealers start to pull ahead. And HP burn gets really good. Just these, straight upfront damage dealers are excellent. They're better on normal. They're fairly equal on hard, probably a bit better. It's really Brutal Nightmare where stuff pulls ahead. So if you don't have a Royal Guard, you can absolutely use champions like Yannicka, or again Moranix, who is a recent the last fusion. Really good damage dealer for like normal hard. Gonna be fantastic. Single target works well with Hex. Brimstone. Did he have Brimstone here? Didn't have Brimstone. That's done without Brimstone, but Brimstone adds a lot of damage. One of the other samples does. Cruelty Blessing, having one of those on an AoE champion to apply that to all the heads, very helpful. Best auras, speed, accuracy, resistance, HP, kind of in that aura for me. Survivability and speed is more important than damage on damage dealers. You'll see that in my builds and stuff as well. Just surviving and taking lots of turns is usually worth more. We talked about mischief targeting, and be really careful. This is a big mistake you see newer players make. They'll bring in like block debuffs or counterattack or ally protection. Increased crit rate's another good one. And if you don't have a good source of block buffs and good speed manipulation, you keep block buffs on mischief all the time. If he steals counterattack or block buffs even one time and puts that on the heads, that can kill your run right there and then. So be really careful about those. That's part of why actually I do think that things like shield are so good. Shield is amazing because the shield is huge for you, but if it does ever get stolen by the Hydra heads and spread around, it's a minuscule shield on them. You won't even notice it. So the shield is massive for you, but it's tiny for them, so that's something to watch out for. So that was team 1. That was a good example on hard. We had another example on hard. This was from Vile Rock, and he posted this in the Discord as well. I thought the cool thing about this was the first time that he one-keyed hard difficulty. So to give you an idea, and he was 6 months into the game. This is right before he got Seal of the Drakes. Now he's obviously very lucky. He had the guaranteed neck Mothar. You can see Brimstone really adding lots of damage there. He's very lucky to have a Withier as well, so that certainly helps. He's had good champs. So luck does play a part, but still, as a free-to-play, I thought this was so impressive. Even with some good luck, being able to take down Hydra one key, dramatically so, he's a good chunk over the requirement, was super impressive. So we can see here again, he has the 2 damage dealers. The Husk is level 56, really not geared well. The Husk is struggling. Nekmothar with the Brimstone is out damaging Husk substantially, which is very funny. But again, you can come and look at this and you can see the sort of things that we're getting here. Nekmothar is an S tier champion for Hydra. Speed Aura, increase speed, turn meter, decrease speed, leech, decrease attack. Ultimate Death Knight with his passive gives you a great source of mischief tank. He gives you shielding, continuous heal, and decrease attack as well. So he's so good for keeping you alive. With your cleansing and healing, Geomancer and Husk, 2 damage dealers, and then Ursula. So this team, you can see one thing with this team, obviously, you know, it's a fantastic team for this point in the game. You can see there's definitely quite a bit of overlap in terms of what they're doing. Like Ursula is bringing decrease attack, but we've got decrease attack from Nekmothar, super consistent and even pretty good from Ultimate Death Knight. Increase attack doesn't really benefit anyone very much. Increase defense, we already have that from Withier. The strengthen is very good, that's true, and having a revive is decent, but she's not bringing too much to this team. She's like, again, I'd say an S tier epic for Hydra. She doesn't necessarily bring that much to this team, but, you know, he still built a good team, tried it out, and got there. Sample Team 3 then I thought was an interesting one to show you, although he did catch it on the load screen, so it's a bit blurred out here, but still, this was 42.9 million damage on Nightmare, and this was from Budsfan67, which again was his first time getting the 1 key. I'm pretty sure that's what he said, was this first time 1 keying Nightmare, and again he is a good chunk over the damage requirement. It's 36.6 million, I think. I can see this team actually has 1 damage dealer. It's Tumisia doing almost all of it with the AoE HP burn. So it's a very survivable team with a lot of control, lots of speed, tons of speed right here. So you can see with this team, you know, he's got Cardial. Cardial's giving the ally attack. He's cleansing, a speed aura, lots of healing from Cardial. Ugo bringing in the block buffs and decreased defense. Tumisia doing all the damage. Snicktrack is shielding with decreased speed and ally protection. We've got increased speed, decreased speed from Lady Kimmy. We've got turn meter boosting from Arbiter as well. So this is going to be like a very quick team. You can just see the healing from Cardial is just absolutely huge as well. So it's a team that really is just, we take so many turns that even when Tumisia's eaten, we can break her out. She's got the Brimstone as well, pumps out a lot of damage. So I thought that would be kind of useful, guys. Just 3 different teams. And like I said, there's constantly team suggestions here in the team showcase section. I try to do lots of videos on Hydra myself as well. But hopefully this gives you a nice idea, a nice introduction. And like I said, I will link this on my Discord channel to help you start to look at your champions, figure out which champions are good for Hydra. Do we bring the important stuff? How to counter these different heads. These are just a selection of what I think are the most important things to bring. Some suggestions, restats, and then some sample teams. Hope you enjoyed. Big info dump, I know. It's a big info dump, but I do hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did, and subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.